You did not.
I can see that
It's true. All right. Let's do this. So I will give you the 3, 2, 1, sir, and you'll be ready to start. No worries. Okay. All right, you are perfectly within my camera angle.
Okay.
See?
To be or not to be, that is the question. This is the most famous existential question posed in all of literature, but although it refers to human mortality, we can apply it to a political institution that we have known since the very beginning, the Electoral College. I believe that the Electoral College should be abolished on these 3 grounds: that it doesn't accurately reflect the national popular will, that it elects plurality presidents, and that it hampers the bids of third-party candidates. But before we delve into a criticism of the Electoral College, we must understand the composition of the institution. When looking at an electoral map of the United States, we can discern that there's a total of 538 electoral votes. But you may wonder, where are these numbers derived from? Well, there's 100 senators, or 2 per state, 435 representatives, which is based off of population. The larger your state population, the more representatives, the smaller, the less. And 3 electors from the District of Columbia, for a total of 538. So now that we understand the composition of the Electoral College, we can adequately delve into a criticism of the institution. And that brings me to my first point, that the Electoral College does not accurately reflect the national popular will. And there's actually 2 ways in which this occurs. And the first way is through the overrepresentation of the less populous regions of the country. If we look at the 1988 election, for example, the combined voting age population of the 7 least populous regions in the United States, including the District of Columbia, carried the same electoral voting strength, or 21 electoral votes, as the state of Florida. So if a Floridian were to cast their vote in the 1988 presidential election, their vote would carry about 1/3 the weight of a vote cast in these 7 places. Now, the second way that the Electoral College does not accurately reflect the national popular will is through its emphasis on swing states. If we're to look at a map of the United States and look at the 11 swing states, we can see that they total to about 146 electoral votes. And this is about 46% of the needed votes, 54% of the 270 votes to win the election, which is pretty close to winning. That's over half. Now, the second way that the Electoral College fails us is through its election of plurality presidents. And you may wonder, what do I mean by a plurality? And by a plurality, I mean a candidate that has won less than 50% or more of the votes, but still wins, since they've won the largest single share of the votes. So a candidate could end up winning about 47% or 48% of the vote. But as long as they have the largest single share, they would win the election. And amazingly, this has occurred about 18 times in our nation's history, most recently in the year 2000. And some very famous presidents have been elected on a plurality, including Lincoln, Nixon, Kennedy, and Truman. Now, at this point in the presentation, I must make a concession to proponents of the Electoral College, and that it does provide us with a stable 2-party system. But what many see as stability, I see as the propagation of old ideas and the stifling of new ones. And this brings us to our third point, that the Electoral College hampers the bids of third-party candidates. And a perfect example of this occurring is Eugene Debs, who is a 5-time Socialist Party candidate for the presidency in 1900, 1904, 1908, 1912, and 1920. And the best performance by Debs was 5.9% of the national popular vote. But even Debs failed to carry a single electoral vote. And the best performance ever by a third-party candidate the United States political history was Theodore Roosevelt in 1912. He won 27% of the national popular vote, but again carried only 88 electoral votes, which is far from the needed 270. Now, the third way, that was the third way. An alternative for electoral college that can be implemented with or without the electoral college is instant runoff voting. Now, instant runoff voting is basically ranked choice voting. And instant runoff voting is aimed at alleviating what's called the spoiler effect, where a voter has to choose between the lesser of two evils or two-party candidates. Because if they were to vote for a third-party candidate, their third-party candidate might spoil the vote or throw it to another candidate. So a popular situation that people use to explain instant runoff voting is the situation of Tennessee choosing a new location for their state capital. So in the first round of voting, Memphis receives 42% of the votes. And in traditional voting, the election would be over since they have the largest single share of the vote, even though it's just a plurality. So in electoral and instant runoff voting, Chattanooga would be eliminated in the first round of voting. But for people who listed Chattanooga as their first choice city, that 15% would go to their second choice city, which in this case would be Knoxville. So in the second round of voting, Knoxville sits at 32% of the vote. Now it's Nashville that has the smallest percentage of the votes, and they would be eliminated in the second round. But for people who listed Nashville as their first choice city, that 26% would go to their second choice city, which would be Chattanooga. But since Chattanooga is eliminated, that 26% goes to their third choice city, which would be Knoxville. So in the third and final round of the instant runoff voting, Knoxville would have 58%, which would achieve an absolute majority and solve the problem of having a plurality. Now to recap, we talked about how the Electoral College does not accurately reflect the national popular will in two ways. We talked about how the Electoral College has elected plurality presidents 18 times in our nation's history. And we also discussed how the Electoral College hampers the bids of third-party candidates. So to conclude today, I would like to leave you with the words of Founding Father James Madison, who argued for political expression in the 10th essay of the Federalist Papers, writing to extend the sphere and take in a greater variety of parties and interests. You make it less probable that a majority of the whole will have a common motive to invade the rights of other citizens. And I hope that our political institutions can take his advice. Thank you.
All right. Fill out a here is Al for Caleb Holder.